Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and honor to hand over to the next panel session. This is a panel that's sponsored by DLA Piper, and I will hand over to Dominic Piper, who will introduce the panel topic as well as moderate and facilitate the panel discussion. I'd like to thank my speakers that are currently on stage. You are free to go. And yeah, we'll hand over and move it forward. Dominic?
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Farai, for a superbly chaired session. Really engaging. Again, I was just commenting to someone earlier that there's been so much content already in this conference, both here on the stage and out in the exhibition space and elsewhere in the lobby and elsewhere, that it feels like it's been going on for 5 days already, but we're only up to session 3, day 1. But that's okay, because this is what we're here for. It's a once-in-a-year opportunity to really delve into the Australian-African mining story. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Dominic Piper. I'm the editor of Australia's Paydirt and Gold Mining Journal, and I'm also the chief box mover at this conference. So if you pick up your delegate bags and there's something missing from it, come and see me, because that was my job over the last week. It's also my job to be the moderator for this panel on critical minerals. As Bill Repard, in his opening remarks, mentioned this morning, when this conference started 20 years ago, critical minerals wasn't even a discussion point. Every mineral was critical, no minerals were critical. In the last 4 years, 5 years, the rise of critical minerals as both an investment market, but also a political debate has risen inexorably in that time, and we really like to capture what's happening in the sector, how it relates to Australian investment on the African continent, how it relates to African governments, African communities, and the future of the industry on the continent. So I've given our panellists a not too insignificant goal in front of them to solve all of that in the next 43 minutes or so. Let me introduce our panellists. I'll start on my far left, although not politically, I would have thought, Tim. Tim Harrison is Managing Director of Ionic Rare Earths. Tim joined Ionic in February 2020 to drive the development of the Ngocho Rare Earth project, and the company to now integrate into new emerging Western supply chains through refining and recycling of magnet rare earths. Tim is a metallurgist with 23 years of experience in the resources industry, involving roles from the full life cycle of project development to operations. And obviously the Ngocho project is an emerging project in Uganda. Next to Tim is Neil Herbert, chairman of Atlantic Lithium. Atlantic is another ASX-listed company operating in Ghana. Tim is a chartered accountant with more than 30 years' experience in finance and has been involved in growing mining and oil and gas companies as both an executive and an investor. He was previously managing director of AIM-listed Polar Resources and a director at Galahad Gold. Neil has also held board positions at a number of resources companies, where he's been involved in managing numerous acquisitions, disposals, listings, and fundraisings. He holds a joint honours degree in economics and economic history from the University of Leicester. Neil, thanks for joining us. To my right, again, I'm not going to make the politics joke anymore, is Mzila Mthenjane, CEO-elect, designate in place now of the Minerals Council of South Africa, who we've heard from just before. So just to explain, Zilla is executive head of stakeholder affairs at Exxaro and a CEO for the Minerals Council. In between his other roles, he is credited with successfully leading the development of Exxaro's sustainable impact approach, as well as establishing Exxaro's ESG narrative for stakeholder engagement. Through his leadership, Exxaro has remained amongst the top performers for integrated reporting, as acknowledged by local and offshore ratings agencies. And then finally, to my extreme right, is Burure Ngocho, partner at IMMA Advocates and DLA Piper in Tanzania. And I should, of course, say that, as Faraz mentioned earlier, that DLA Piper is our sponsor for this session. Burure is a partner whose practicing areas include general corporate, mergers and acquisitions, banking and finance, and energy and minerals. She's assisted various recognized international non-government organizations, information and registration, as well as providing general legal advice. She's worked with numerous successful transactions and has worked well as part of teams handling some of the major transactions in Tanzania. She's also assisted numerous major clients to successfully obtain clearances for mergers and acquisitions occurring locally or indirectly. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I should point out this is an interactive session. There will be time for questions from the floor, so please start thinking about your questions now, and we can take some. There'll be a roving microphone later on, so you can take some questions. Burure, I may start with you if I can, because I want you to set the scene. Yeah, ladies first, but more importantly, I want you to set the scene for us. In Tanzania, your home country and area of expertise, obviously, but in a broader African sense, here in Western Australia and in Australia, and indeed the whole world, we're having a debate about critical minerals policy at the moment, how countries should approach critical minerals development, who they should partner with, what they should leave to the market, what they should see government intervention. Can you give us a sort of a state of play in Tanzania, first of all, about where this country with vast resources of critical minerals, graphite in particular, rare earths as well, where does Tanzania sit? Has the country developed a coherent, defined critical minerals policy?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Tanzania, just like a lot of the African countries, have not yet created a solid policy when it comes to critical minerals. As many of you are aware, Tanzania is just opening up again for minerals as a point and as a country of interest. So they have not been dictating at the moment as to who should come in and who the mining companies should be selling the critical minerals to. But Tanzania is open for everyone. We've had interest from across the globe. We've had interest from Canadian companies, from Australian companies, even though the majority of the SMLs issued in the past year or so have been to predominantly Australian companies for critical minerals. And we have seen more recently one of the Australian companies in Tanzania entering into an arrangement with POSCO. So again, Tanzania has not really had a critical minerals policy, but they're open to anyone who has interest in Tanzania to come along and bring forward the best deal possible.
It struck me earlier this year when U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris came to Africa, but came to Tanzania, and specifically mentioned the Kabanga nickel project. That this is a project that many people in the room will be familiar with. It's an iconic and almost mythical project in African mining circles. What effect may the US interest, European interest, Korean, Japanese interest in critical minerals on the African continent, what might that mean for the development of a project like Kabanga? How will the government deal with that?
At the moment, there is no clear strategy that has been presented. And I think it's more of an engagement with the current investors. As you're aware, BHP have a 51% stake in that, and it was not a prerequisite to the issuance of the licenses for them to offset the nickel extracted to any specific country or anyone of a specific interest. So I would pretty much say at the moment it's anyone who wants to buy the nickel coming out of there should put their money where their mouth is.
I think that's a very interesting area. Mzila, you may be able to comment on in the South African context, because again we see in Australia and Canada and the US and Europe a debate around who should be gaining access to these critical minerals. What policies can we put in place to make sure that they're diversifying the global supply chains of these critical minerals? Is that a debate that's going on in South Africa at the moment, and how developed is that debate?
I think similar to Tanzania, or maybe let me just start by greeting in this session. Mzila, Mthenjane, thank you very much for welcoming us here. I think maybe it's important to set the scene that being CEO of Minerals Council, we're an advocacy body in the country. And so we advocate for the kind of policies and environment that will lead to successful mining. And I think it was probably my first week in my new job that actually with the team, we really started to debate the whole issue about critical minerals. And then it was a week later that we hosted the first African Critical Minerals Conference in South Africa. And as a team, we had been debating that how should we position ourselves as an advocacy body. And we said we want to take a leadership role in working with government in ensuring that South Africa actually has a well-defined critical mineral strategy, because what we're seeing so far is that the critical minerals narrative is driven by developed countries in terms of what they need for their future technology developments. We need to look at a critical minerals from an African and emerging market perspective, given where we are from a development perspective. So actually, all minerals are critical. From a South African perspective, it's not an expression that we are unfamiliar with. I think in the early days of democracy, we adopted the expression of strategic minerals with the view of driving transformation and empowerment through certain commodities, which we know we're well endowed with, such as coal, platinum, gold. It was pretty much across the whole mineral spectrum. And so this is really just an opportunity to build on that. To make sure that we really make sure South Africa comes first. The continent needs to come first. And so what I'm seeing is an opportunity where the continent, South Africa, needs to actually also set its agenda of what to expect and what it will contribute towards this discussion and exploration of critical minerals.
Thank you. Neil, can I turn to you now? In a very similar way to South Africa and to Tanzania, Ghana has got a well-established mining sector, in particular in gold, obviously, but lithium. Atlantic is the first company to be developing a lithium project in the country. Has the government established a definitive and distinct policy around lithium and critical minerals that sets it apart from precious metals? And how has Atlantic found its position in that space?
Thank you. So Atlantic today is, as you said, the first project in lithium in Ghana. The government has announced that it will be creating a policy, and I thank the Minerals Commission who have been in consultation regarding how that policy will be implemented. So it's in process, but I think the message from the Ghana government is what it wants to do, and I think this is the correct approach, is to encourage development as soon as possible. So in terms of the policy and in terms of making sure that projects get licensed on a timely basis so it adds to the economy in Ghana, that they're approaching that now, while at the same time looking at the opportunity for downstream and indeed for byproducts that we have from the project, such as feldspar.
Thank you, Neil. Tim, Uganda is a very different proposition because unlike the three countries that the other panelists are familiar with, Uganda doesn't have a deep, mature, large-scale mining sector. Yet Ionic has gone in there and defined a huge resource and a world-class opportunity in the rare earth space. What have your conversations been with the Ugandan government about the particular nuances around rare earths as a critical mineral and its position in the global supply chain, and what role Uganda and Ngocho could play in that?
Thanks, Dom. I think the importance of Ngocho within the Ugandan context as a flagship project enables us to produce, magnet and heavy rare earths in a value-added product with our initial development of Ngocho. Additional processing beyond that is significantly more complex than the product that we'd be making in the first place. So, yeah, we're engaging with the Ugandan government to help them understand the amount of capital investment, the infrastructure, the human capital that's required, the requirement for high purity reagents and analytical capability, and there's a very long list of things that that are prerequisites for further value addition in the rare earth space, to the extent where these are facilities that don't actually exist presently in the US or Europe. So it's a process, and it's an aspirational process, and we're working with the Ugandan government to map that out. I think from a context of where Makuutu sits right now, keeping it as simple as we can, to produce product, to monetize the development, build capacity and grow. It's a long life project, so we've got time to get it right.
Tim, it's interesting you mentioned that the value addition, beneficiation and downstream processing. It's a conversation we've had here at Africa Down Under for many years regarding a whole host of commodities. But it's also a conversation that's occurring here in Western Australia around the critical minerals sector, and in North America and Europe as well. Neil, can I ask you, in the Ghana context, is there pressure on Atlantic to display a path or produce a path towards value addition, and how does that conversation go with government and trying to find a path towards downstream processing in the lithium space?
So obviously Ghana is a very well-developed jurisdiction, has over 100 years of mining operations, and indeed has highly qualified staff available to us. And the government's very keen that we develop as much of the opportunity as possible in country, but at the same time wants to see the development on a timely basis. And I think one of the key issues here in terms of downstream is considering, do you have enough feedstock for a chemical plant, for example, over a sufficient period of time and sufficient resources. So the government is balancing that, and we're working with the government to see what opportunity there may be on the downstream. But at the same time, as I say, I think Ghana has taken a very pragmatic approach to this in terms of ensuring that development happens on a timely basis of the mining operation, so that we're adding to the economy of Ghana sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Neil. But we talked earlier, and we were having a conversation earlier on about Tanzania has been a remarkable country in the last 10 years. It regards mining policy and mining investment and obligations of foreign investors. What effect will that journey that the country's been on in the last 10 years, perhaps, have on the critical mineral space? Do you expect to see demands upon companies to enact downstream processing policies in the critical mineral space?
So in Tanzania, in the past 5 or 6 years, we've experienced a lot of regulatory changes. And one of them was to introduce the requirement for local beneficiation. This is a compulsory requirement now placed on anyone with an SML license. That's a special mining license, and it's the biggest type of license you could have, and would involve an investment of not less than $100 million. So anyone now being granted a license for a special mining project, they would automatically be required to have some kind of local beneficiation. And this does not just apply to critical minerals, but all minerals. With regards to mining licenses, that requirement is not so stringent. So if there's no facilities on the ground, they're still granted permission to export the minerals once extracted. But that requirement is pretty much there, and I don't think it's going anywhere.
Mzila, in South Africa, it's a similar but very different situation at the same time, in that the PGMs industry has moved directly into the auto industry for so long through catalytic converters and the like. How is the government trying to position itself and the industry trying to find a platform to be able to produce and a value add in a country where perhaps we don't see the skills that China or Japan or Korea has?
So I think there are probably a number of ways, and not just looking at the position from a mining perspective, but some of the other enablers in terms of energy. So maybe starting with energy, we're seeing, yes, we're trying to address the challenges with Eskom from a particular base load, but we've seen how successful we were in terms of building up to about 6 to 7 gigawatts of renewable energy. And more recently, where the policy was put in place that you don't need, formal permitting processes for 100 megawatts of renewables. So that's been quite encouraging. And the mining industry is set to install possibly, another 7 gigawatts of renewables. So from an energy security, those policies are actually in the right direction. From a mining perspective, I think, Errol made mention of, firstly, in terms of exploration, the cadastral system, such that wherever you're in the world, you can find out what is possible in South Africa. Because that process from an administration is important. Overall, from a policy perspective, I think well-established policies. From an existing operator, I think what we would advocate for is more coherence in terms of much quicker process of application. It doesn't need to take 300 days. If we could put ourselves to compete with other countries where it can take 30 days to get your prospecting right, and maybe 3 months to get your mining right. Very ambitious targets, but I think it can be done, and it's something we need to do with an intent of growing and developing the mining industry. And so that needs to be the base upon which we then continue to explore with critical minerals. And whilst we may not have, similar to what other African countries have, but we're already developing some of those, PGMs being amongst, there was mention of manganese. And those are lessons we can easily take to other countries in the continent.
Is it crucial that a country like South Africa develops a defined critical minerals policy? Is that going to be important in being able to fund and attract investment into new projects?
I think it is, and I think, as mentioned, for every country, it's going to be important. I read an article once that said, I think in the first instance, we probably don't have enough of these minerals to be able to take us to this new low-carbon future. So there's intense competition for investment capital in each country. So I think to the extent that there's clarity for investors and anyone who can enable this exploration to take place, the better for the country. There needs to be clarity in terms of, I think, the country's economic and social development strategy as far as being able to attract investment and how that revenue is going to be reinvested, because that then results in a much better context for mining to continue to succeed.
Thank you. Tim, can I ask you, in that context of international investors, particularly in that critical mineral space, we're seeing investors place even more emphasis on ESG and sustainable outcomes than we are even in other commodities, in more traditional commodities. Is a country like Uganda and a project like Ngocho capable of meeting those expectations? And what is your interaction with investors around ESG and sustainability outcomes in regards to producing a rare earth product?
So I think because rare earths are key ingredients in facilitating the energy transition, sustainable production of rare earths is even more important, right? There's no point in making material if you're destroying the environment in doing so, or corrupting the local community and social fabric by implementing standards and systems that don't work. So it is imperative that high ESG standards are implemented essentially from the outset, and a lot of the engagement that we've had with potential strategic partners, whether they be in the US, Europe, Japan, or Korea, it is very, very high on the set of questions that get asked from the outset that need to be answered, and they need to be satisfactorily in place before the significant investment will flow. So without implementing these ESG standards, it's going to be impossible to finance projects.
Neil, would you concur with that? And also more broadly, perceptions around investment risk in Africa, in Ghana in particular, investors concerned about making investments in critical minerals projects in Africa?
So I think you need to differentiate one country to another, because the reality is Africa is not one country, and east to west, north to south, country by country, you have to look at them individually. Ghana, fortunately, as I say, has a very long history in mining. in respect of the project that we're doing, and you're absolutely right, you need to have the highest standards that you possibly can have. In terms of being actually working with the US or working with European off-takers, they expect you to have those standards, and you need to meet them in terms of you're going to put our product into their processes. So we've been, I think, very systematic on this since the start of the company in terms of having very high standards in terms of dealing with the community. So our engagement's been very high. Most of our employment comes from the local communities. We've been working with the communities. One of the nice feedback that we've had from the Minerals Commission is that actually there's a pressure there from the local communities and from the region to see the development of the project as quickly as possible. And I think those very high standards are there. I mean, we're also blessed in Ghana being so well developed, and particularly where we are relative proximate to the port, so we're only 110 kilometers away from a minerals handling facility with existing capacity, so we don't need to do anything there. We have a paved road which currently handles traffic to that port. It's only 110 kilometers, which is a real boon. And finally, we have power on site, which we actually have to move the power line across the site so we can start working. So all of that is all there, and that power primarily comes from hydro. So very good characteristics for the project. We are blessed where we are, it being in Ghana, but also where we are in Ghana in terms of what we have available there.
Thank you, Neil. Now, I'm quite a greedy journalist, as you can see, and I ask all the questions, but I would like to open it up to the floor now. Does anybody have a question or comment to make regarding the panel so far? We've got a question. We may not have a microphone, though. We may have to borrow. I'm sorry. What I may get is, if you guys can share, and if you guys can share.
Anyway, I could have been loud enough, so. All right, just a question. Talking about critical mineral policy, I believe these very minerals we're talking of are found in Australia and other parts of the world as well, even in Canada. Why can't we look at the policy development, globalizing the policy development such that how it is practiced or how it is done here in Australia, in Canada, and in most of the advanced countries could be replicated in the same way in Africa? Then in that case, we have one document. Of course, there will be some variations with cultural and other things, but then one document serving a common purpose for all of us, because it's a global need. All right, that's my question.
Burure, I think you should take that one first. As the lawyer on the panel, is it possible to have an all-encompassing Critical Minerals Act and policy and regulations across continents?
I doubt it. It's a good ideology, but I don't think the practicalities of it is possible. Each region has its own concerns, has its own priorities. So it may be possible to have certain key elements be across the board, certain topics may be covered. So maybe more of an outline document as what type of topics need to be covered within such a policy. But to say that you can have one that's globally applicable, I don't think you can even have one that can apply across Africa, let alone across the globe. Yeah.
Maybe, I think it's an ambitious question, and perhaps from where we're sitting, it might look impossible. The way I think about it is the way that I explained earlier, that you've got two sides at the moment. The one side, the developed world, and the other being the emerging markets and developing country. And that's perhaps where you could begin to see some alignment in terms of how the developed world defines critical minerals for what they're going to use it for. But that introduces a whole set of challenges given the geopolitics and the potential use of those minerals. There might perhaps be a chance on the supplier side, given that if you look at how we talk about putting in place favorable policies, that's pretty much aligning, and it's along that dimension that I think we could get commonality on defining the supply of critical minerals. But I don't think we can avoid the us versus them in terms of suppliers versus potential users. And I think from an African perspective, we really do need to begin with the fact that we need the iron ore, the infrastructure, commodities to be able to develop the necessary infrastructure. We also need to begin to look forward such that we also don't get left behind in as far as the transition is concerned, where energy transition is concerned and technology transitions are concerned. I think those are questions.
Oh, we've got a question just over here. Thanks, Yvette.
Thanks. And similar to the previous question and along the lines of what you've both sort of answered, I was just curious to understand what references you'd be taking from the global changes with respect to climate, nature, diversity, inequality, that you could write into your policies around critical minerals to actually both support the infrastructure that you need to build in country and also to ensure that when we're talking about the new economy and sovereignty and all of that, so would you be able to elaborate if you're looking at those taxonomies and considering them in your policy?
Seeing as I have the mic, I'll venture the response. But I'll also refer to my previous employer at Exxaro, a coal mining company in South Africa, and a key player in the energy value chain supplying to Eskom. And what's important about ESG, as discussed by the other gentleman, is that it's not merely done for investor attraction. I think it needs to be integrated into the business strategy. And understanding the context within which you're operating, the nature of your business, and the kind of impact you can have in the country. And the strategy we took with Exxaro was to look at the future of the business, particularly the coal business, long life assets located in rural locations. And so, and the big challenge that we also then had to solve with that was the one of skills. We put mines that are located at a distance constantly import skills. And then you have locals say, well, we can't just be relegated to the low skills. We also want to see the general manager of the mine coming from amongst us. And as you're implementing those, also consider the social setting from a diversity and the degree to which in your actions you will have impact on women. You need to play you need to really understand the social setting from the structure, culturally, traditionally, and play into that and not try and change that. So that's an important issue, and that's where you then begin to bring in the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think one of the things that made Exxaro successful was that it started at the top. It was led from the top by the board. And to the extent that I think Exxaro perhaps to this day remains one of the few companies where the stakeholder engagement in as far as engaging with communities is also conducted by the Social Ethics and Responsibility Committee and other members of the board in terms of a program on the ground twice a year to go out and meet communities. And the purpose is not to tell communities, but to sit and listen. And you sit and listen with the managers who then have to hear how bad they are, despite the fact that there's a lot of effort being made to improve. And I think the challenge is not so much that the mines are bad, but the social challenges are so large that no one mine company can make a difference. And that is then supported by a formal and annual governance process. So leadership from the top, what I used to call intentional engagement in terms of being clear on why you engage. And through that, you then begin to see ESG really becoming part of the company, that it doesn't have to be a by the way.
Thanks, Mzila. Neil, again, going back to a point we made earlier, that Atlantic being in a new commodity for Ghana, does it give you an opportunity to set a new standard and a new approach to ESG and sustainability in the country?
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity here for us, and as I emphasised before, very pleased of the 10-year development of this company and its history in Ghana, that we've always been very engaged at the community level and very much put the communities first in what we're doing. So I agree with everything that's been said here. You need to support at the community level, you need to support at the regional level, and you need to support at the national level if you're going to make a success of a business. But more than that, you have to think about what you're giving back and what you're contributing to the communities which you're involved with.
Thank you. Tim, in the Ugandan context, we hear a lot in the Australian critical mineral space about how being involved in lithium or other future minerals helps attract a younger generation to the industry and to support an industry that perhaps over the decades has had a bad reputation amongst progressive people. What's the situation in Uganda? Do you feel that Ionic will be able to build a workforce and build a community and stakeholder support because it's a company that will be contributing to a clean energy future?
Well, I think we are. So I think we've got about 80 in Uganda, staff and contractors of about 80 at the moment. We are able to attract some really good candidates and build a really good national team. And I think part of it is also the opportunity that's been presented through the development of Makutu for, a career, right? An opportunity to develop the skill sets and to grow with the business as the asset grows. So I think that is a big attraction. I think the opportunity to be part of something that will be, transformational for Uganda as well is a big attraction for potential employees. From a community engagement perspective, obviously there's a lot of very interested, supportive stakeholders in the local districts in which we operate, including the local kingdom. So it's tremendous support, excited by the opportunity that is going to be delivered through mining.
Thanks, Tim. Did we have any other questions from the floor? Hopefully we do. No, just going to leave me to do all of the work again. Now I want to address a rather controversial topic. Controversial might not be the wrong word, but heated topic. At the moment, we're seeing on a global level a real rush for critical minerals, access to critical minerals. We're seeing the US with hundreds of billions of dollars in funding. We're seeing EU with hundreds of billions of dollars in funding. We're seeing Japan and Korea with similar levels of investment in the sector. And then countries from through the Western prism, they are seen as trying to diversify supply. Yet countries such as China are dominating supply. And certainly in the Australian context, the question is, how do we diversify supply away from China? Is that a similar debate that's happening in Africa? Or is the context coming from an emerging economy very different? Burure, it's a tough one, but...
So I think whenever you're talking of critical minerals and what that means to African countries, you have to look at it in the context of Africa. A country like Tanzania, unlike even South Africa and Ghana, has only opened up its mining sector since 1998. So it is relatively a young market. So before really delving into anything that may be too controversial, it's from my perspective, I would think that they should take a step back before jumping in with both feet. Understand, first of all, what their needs are before trying to solve everyone else's problems. For those of us from Africa, we have something called a black tax. A black tax is when you start looking after your whole entire family without having sorted out the needs inside your home. So I would probably recommend that for most of the African countries, they first try to understand what the needs are locally and then try to delve into the global issues that may affect them because those will only come secondary after they understand what their internal needs are.
And maybe just to add that, because this was actually the essence of my presentation earlier on, because there's a potential to be overwhelmed as potential suppliers with all of this attention. And, there's also been said that we're seeing a new scramble for Africa. And the importance is then to take a pause and think clearly of what's in it for us. Because without that, I think we could potentially suffer yet again the resource curse, which has been well defined. We've seen how, with this kind of attention, it can lead to corruption, where it's the politicians who benefit at the expense of the country, and we need to overcome that as a continent. And hence the need that I think for the kind of partnerships and collaboration that needs to happen between all the social partners in each country around, okay, with this potential and emergent commodity boom that's going to be driving us to a low carbon future, how are we going to get, and the important issue that is being discussed in terms of the energy transition is the just transition. If we don't take a pause and reflect on the long term and reflect on the past in terms of what we don't, or the mistakes we shouldn't repeat, we're actually going to continue to leave people behind. And so I think I really agree with you that we do, as a continent, need to pause and reflect and be clear on the question of what's in it for us, because it's an opportunity to sit with confidence at the table with those who want the minerals and say, this is what we'd like from a development perspective. What are the trade-offs?
Thank you. We did have a question, I think. Oh, no, we don't have a question anymore. Tim, can I ask
one there.
Oh, we have got one.
I think I want to underscore what Burure and Mzila pointed out. The critical minerals are so critical to Africa. I don't think that we have that luxury of getting involved in geopolitics between whatever powers and China. I think we are faced with unsustainable poverty levels. And this is where I think our entire attention is to see how best can our resources benefit our people, our economies, and get us out of this unsustainable poverty level situation. The luxury of geopolitics between China and anybody, I think, let it focus on the countries that can afford to do that. Thank you.
I think that certainly those who are, who are demonstrating this huge demand for these minerals are providing what is a potential market. So I think that's positive. And so we then need to say, how do we make sure we extract the minerals with responsibility and accountability from an ESG perspective? How do we make sure that the revenues that are generated and the kind of arrangements we have with these potential off-takers actually also benefit us and reinvest for the benefit of the country and begin to build the country and see Africa really begin to play its role in the world.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we've got time for one more question. If somebody had a burning question that they think is going to surprise us all. Yes, we have got one. Just over here, please. One of our most esteemed and longest serving Africa Down Under delegates.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A founding member of ADU. Might I ask, I find that we talk about critical minerals and strategic minerals interchangeably. Do you have some views on what makes some minerals strategic and others critical? Are there considerations that bring about this differentiation at all that you can enlighten us with, which I assume will inform what choices you make about the policies that you take forward? Thank you very much.
I think if I had the Mining Charter 2002, I'd be able to quote what we defined as strategic minerals then. So I think firstly, it's a selection of minerals which from the country's perspective are deemed will play an important role in the economic development of the country, given where the country finds itself. We're not seeing the definition of critical minerals being any different from that for those countries that have offered that. So America has its definition, which is driven by its needs to support military as well as technological developments. And there's a commonality of that definition across when you move to Europe and to China and to Japan, where technology is playing a very important role in as far as what critical minerals are. So, fast forward from early 2000, when South Africa defined strategic minerals, to 20 years later, I think that definition pretty much has remained the same, where we prefer to use strategic at the time, and critical is being used today.
Thank you. I think what we summed up there is that the critical is in the eyes of the beholder. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us to this panel. We've only just scratched the surface of the debate that could last for the rest of the conference. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we've got plenty of other opportunities to discuss. Plenty of stories to hear, both from countries and companies. But can I just ask you to join us in thanking our panelists, Tim, Neil, Mzila, and Burure. I should point out in the area of South Africa, there'll be an investment lunch seminar tomorrow over the road at the Novotel about South Africa's critical mineral strategy and future. So if you would like to participate in that, by all means, please come along. It's a first come, first served basis. So there's a great opportunity for that. And I should also point out that the West Australian Government Mines Department is hosting a seminar on Friday morning, inviting our international guests to come and learn about WA's mining policies, particularly around critical minerals, downstream processing and value addition, as well as all aspects of their mining regulation. So if anybody would like information about to join that seminar, please come and let the guys know at the Paydirt information booth. And after that, I think we should break for afternoon tea. Thank you very much. Afternoon tea is served by Johan and the rest of the Southern Palladium team. So thank you very much to those guys. And we'll see you very shortly for session 4. Thank you.